The thermometer outside Thomas Caldwell's cabin read -32 degrees on the morning he ran out of firewood, but smoke still rose steadily from Lars Eriksson's strange pyramid-shaped stone structure 400 yards away. What happened over the next 6 hours would force every settler in the Montana high country to question everything they knew about surviving winter. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button. Because what Lars discovered about heat and geometry changed frontier architecture forever. The fire in the cabin was dying again. Lars Eriksson opened his eyes in the darkness and knew immediately from the cold pressing against his face that the temperature inside had dropped below freezing. He sat up on his sleeping platform, his breath visible in the faint orange glow from the fireplace embers. Across the small room, his younger brother Henrik coughed, a wet, rattling sound that had been getting worse for 3 days. It was January of 1853. They were in their second winter in the Montana Territory, homesteading a quarter section in a high valley 30 miles from the nearest trading post. The cabin they had built the previous summer was typical of frontier construction. Logs notched at the corners, chinked with mud and moss, a single door, one small window covered with oiled paper, and a stone fireplace that consumed firewood at an alarming rate. They had thought themselves prepared. They had cut and stacked 8 cords of wood before the first snow. Now, in mid-January, less than 2 cords remained, and the worst of winter stretched ahead. Lars pulled on his boots and heavy coat, moving quietly to avoid waking Henrik, though the coughing made stealth pointless. He added wood to the fire, 3 logs that should have been 2, but Henrik's illness demanded warmth. The logs caught slowly. Lars watched flames spread across the bark, thinking about mathematics he barely understood. They were burning approximately 1 cord of wood every 3 weeks. At that rate, they would run out by late February. March in the high country could be as brutal as January. They needed the wood to last until April. Henrik coughed again, a sound like tearing cloth. Lars turned from the fire and crossed to his brother's sleeping platform. Henrik was 23 years old, 4 years younger than Lars, and he was dying. Lars knew this with certainty, though he had not spoken the thought aloud. The pneumonia had started as a simple cold 2 weeks earlier. In a warm, dry environment, Henrik might have recovered. But their cabin was neither warm nor dry. Moisture from their breathing, from cooking, from melting snow condensed on the inside of the poles. Ice formed in the corners where the chinked gaps let in frigid air. The floor, bare dirt covered with pine branches and blankets, radiated cold that no amount of fire could eliminate. Henrik opened his eyes. His face was pale, his lips blue-tinged despite the blankets piled on his platform. "Is it morning?" His voice was barely a whisper. "Not yet," Lars said. "A few more hours. The fire's going again." Henrik nodded and closed his eyes. His breathing was shallow and rapid. Lars sat beside the platform, helpless, watching his brother struggle for air in a cabin that was supposed to protect them, but was instead killing them slowly. The fire popped and hissed. Wind found gaps in the chinked walls and whistled through, carrying away heat as fast as the burning wood could produce it. Outside, the temperature was probably 20 below zero. Inside, despite the roaring fire, it felt only marginally warmer. Lars thought about their father's farm in Norway, about stone buildings that had stood for centuries in climates as harsh as this one. Henrik died 3 days later, on a morning when the sun rose bright and cold over mountains that seemed indifferent to human suffering. Lars wrapped his brother's body in blankets and carried him outside. The ground was frozen solid, too hard to dig, so Lars placed Henrik in the small shed beside the cabin and sealed the door against animals. He would bury his brother properly when the ground thawed, if he survived that long. Lars spent the rest of that day sitting in the cabin, staring at the fire, watching wood transform into heat that immediately escaped through 100 invisible gaps in the walls and roof. He had built this cabin with his own hands, following patterns he had learned from other settlers, using techniques that every frontier manual recommended. Notched logs, mud chinking, a simple door, minimal windows to retain heat. It was exactly like every other homestead cabin in the territory. And it had failed. The realization came slowly, not as a sudden insight, but as an accumulation of observations he could no longer ignore. The cabin was a box. Heat rose to the ceiling and pooled there, far above where he slept. The walls were thin, single logs thick, offering minimal insulation. The chinked gaps, no matter how carefully packed with mud and moss, dried and cracked in the extreme cold, creating pathways for air infiltration. The fireplace, built into one wall, radiated most of its heat directly up the chimney. The door, constructed from rough planks, had gaps around its frame that whistled with every wind gust. Lars walked around the cabin's interior, running his hands along walls, feeling cold air seeping in at dozens of points. He climbed to check the loft space above the main room. The peaked roof created a volume of air that had to be heated, but served no purpose. Heat accumulated there while he froze below. The entire structure was designed around tradition and convenience, not around the fundamental physics of heat retention. He thought about the 8 cords of wood they had cut. Each cord represented days of labor, hauling and splitting logs. They had burned through 6 cords in 3 months, and his brother had still frozen to death inside a structure specifically built to keep him warm. Something was fundamentally wrong with how frontier cabins were conceived and constructed. That night, Lars let the fire burn lower than usual. He wrapped himself in every blanket he owned and lay on Henrik's sleeping platform, the one closer to the fireplace. He was testing something, though he would not have expressed it in those terms. He was trying to understand the relationship between fire size, wood consumption, and interior temperature. The fire burned. The cabin remained cold. He burned half the wood he normally would have used. The cabin felt only slightly colder. The mathematics were brutal. Doubling the fire did not double the warmth. Most of the heat was simply lost. Lars did not sleep. He lay in the darkness, listening to wind and thinking about stone buildings in Norway that stayed warm with fires a fraction of this size. The images came to Lars in fragments throughout the following days. Stone huts in the Jotunheimen Mountains where shepherds kept summer watch over grazing livestock. His father had taken him there once when Lars was 12 years old, traveling into high pastures to retrieve sheep before autumn snow. They had sheltered overnight in one of the huts, ancient structures built by men whose names were forgotten, but whose work endured. Lars remembered the hut's shape distinctly. It was not rectangular. The walls rose at steep angles, coming together in a point overhead, creating a pyramid of stacked stone. The entrance was low, requiring a person to bend to enter. Inside, the space was surprisingly warm, despite a fire barely larger than what a cooking stove might hold. His father had explained that the hut's shape and thick stone walls held heat that would escape from wooden buildings. Lars had been 12. He had not understood the principles. Now, 23 years later, and an ocean away, the memory felt like a message from the dead. He began sketching in a journal he had brought from Norway but rarely used. His drawings were crude. He had no training in architecture or engineering, but he could reproduce from memory the approximate proportions of those stone huts. The walls sloped inward at angles he estimated at 45 degrees. The footprint was square or nearly so. The height seemed to be roughly equal to the base width, creating a pyramid shape that looked strange, but clearly served a purpose he was only beginning to understand. Lars drew rectangular cabins beside the pyramid sketches, comparing volumes. A rectangular cabin 16 feet by 16 feet with 8-foot walls enclosed 2,048 cubic feet of air. A pyramid with a 16-foot square base and 16-foot height enclosed approximately 1,360 cubic feet. The pyramid held a third less air to heat, yet provided similar floor space. Less air meant less heat required to raise the temperature. He thought about heat. Rising. In a rectangular cabin, hot air rose to the ceiling and stayed there, stratified in useless layers, while cold air pooled at floor level. In a pyramid, hot air would rise naturally toward the apex, but the converging walls would force circulation back downward. The shape itself would create movement that distributed heat more evenly. Then there was the matter of the walls. The Norwegian stone huts had walls 2 feet thick, built from flat stones stacked without mortar. Stone absorbed heat slowly during the day or when fire burned, then released it gradually through the night. Wood walls had no such thermal mass. Heat passed through logs almost immediately, escaping to the outside. Stone walls acted as heat reservoirs, storing warmth and moderating temperature swings. Lars sat in his failing cabin, surrounded by gaps and drafts, sketching pyramid structures and calculating rough volumes. Lars spent 2 weeks in late January preparing, though he told no one what he was preparing for. He continued his trap lines, checking snares and deadfalls in the forest beyond his cabin, gathering enough pelts to justify his presence in the territory. He cut firewood to maintain minimal heat. He melted snow for water and ate sparingly from supplies that would need to last until spring. But his mind was elsewhere, working through problems of construction and geometry that occupied every quiet moment. In early February, during a brief warming spell that brought temperatures above freezing, Lars walked his property looking for the right location. His current cabin sat low near the creek for convenient water access. That had seemed practical when they built it. Now he understood it was a mistake. Cold air sank into valleys. Moisture from the creek created humidity that made cold feel colder and encouraged ice formation inside the cabin. He needed higher ground. He found the spot on the southern end of his quarter section, a slight rise perhaps 30 feet above the creek level. The location offered clear southern exposure, meaning winter sun would strike it directly during the short days when solar heat mattered most. The rise provided natural drainage, preventing water accumulation during spring melt. And the elevation would keep him above the coldest valley air that pooled at night. The site had another advantage Lars recognized from his father's teaching. 200 yards to the north, an ancient glacial moraine created a long ridge of tumbled stone. The rocks were flat, sedimentary layers that had been split and broken by ice, creating thousands of pieces perfect for stacking. Some were as large as a man could lift. Others were smaller, suitable for filling gaps. The variety meant he could select stones for specific purposes rather than forcing unsuitable materials into construction. Lars paced the site, estimating dimensions. A 16-foot square base would provide adequate interior space. The walls would rise at 45-degree angles to a height of 16 feet, creating the pyramid shape he remembered from Norway. He marked the corners with stakes, then stood at the center, visualizing the completed structure. It would look strange. Frontier neighbors would question his sanity, but if his calculations were correct, the pyramid would retain heat with a fraction of the wood his current cabin consumed. The work would be immense. Gathering and hauling stones from the moraine would take weeks. Stacking them precisely at the required angles would demand skills he barely possessed. He would need to construct window frames that fit into sloped walls, engineer a door that sealed properly, and figure out how to build interior floors within a pyramid's converging geometry. He had no formal training. He had only memories of stone huts in Norwegian mountains and a desperate need to survive winters without watching anyone else die from cold. Lars pulled the stakes and returned to his cabin to gather tools. The first stones came down from the moraine on a sled Lars constructed from pine poles and leather straps. Each trip took 2 hours. Walk to the moraine, select appropriate stones, load them onto the sled, drag the sled back to the building site, unload, return for more. He could make 3 trips on a good day, hauling perhaps 800 pounds of stone per trip. The pyramid would require an estimated 40 tons. The mathematics were discouraging, But Lars had learned that survival in the mountains required ignoring discouragement and focusing on the next immediate task. He worked through February, selecting stones with obsessive care. Flat stones for the outer faces, irregularly shaped stones for interior fill, cornerstones with right angles, capstones for the eventual apex. He organized them in piles according to size and shape, creating a stone yard that looked to passing trappers like the work of a madman, building a monument to nothing. Thomas Caldwell rode past on a gray afternoon in late February and stopped to watch Lars dragging another sled load up from the creek bottom. Caldwell was a man in his 40s, an experienced frontiersman who had homesteaded the adjacent property 3 years earlier. His cabin was solid, traditional, built with the efficiency that came from repetition and acceptance of established methods. "You planning to build something?" Caldwell asked from his horse. "A cabin," Lars said. He did not stop working, unloading stones from the sled. "You already have a cabin. I am building a better one." Caldwell watched Lars arrange stones into organized piles. "With rocks, that will take you until next winter. Perhaps. A log cabin takes 4 days with 2 men working." "I know." Caldwell shook his head slowly, the gesture carrying judgment Lars did not miss. "You Norwegians do things the hard way. There is a reason we build with logs. They are everywhere, they go up fast, and they work." Lars straightened and looked at Caldwell directly. "My brother died inside a log. A cabin. It did not work." The statement hung in the cold air between them. Caldwell's expression shifted, discomfort replacing judgment. "Henrik got sick. That happens out here. It was not the cabin's fault." "The cabin was cold," Lars said. "I burned 6 cords of wood in 3 months and it stayed cold. Henrik could not get warm. He died cold." "You want to build a warmer cabin out of rocks?" Caldwell's tone mixed skepticism with something approaching pity. "Son, rock is colder than wood. Everyone knows that." "Rock holds heat," Lars said. "Wood lets it pass through." Caldwell gathered his reins. "You are wasting your time. When you give up on this fool project, come to my place. I will help you put up a proper cabin before next winter." He rode off toward his own homestead, leaving Lars alone with his piles of stone. That evening, sitting in his cold log cabin, eating beans heated over a fire that consumed wood at its usual wasteful rate, Lars allowed himself a moment of doubt. Perhaps Caldwell was right. Perhaps stone construction was impractical. Perhaps he was letting grief drive him toward failure. Then he remembered Henrik's face that last morning, blue-tinged and struggling for breath inside walls built exactly as Caldwell recommended. Lars returned to his sketches and calculations. He would build his pyramid. The foundation began in early March, when the ground had thawed enough to allow shallow excavation. Lars dug a trench following the 16-foot square outline he had staked, removing 8 inches of soil and exposing the harder clay layer beneath. Into this trench he placed his largest, flattest stones, creating a level base that would prevent settling. The foundation work took 5 days. Most frontier cabins had no foundation at all, their logs resting directly on cleared ground where they would eventually rot from moisture contact. The first courses of wall stones went up slowly. Lars had to learn through trial and error how to select stones that would stack stably at a 45-degree angle. Too steep and they would slide inward. Too shallow and the pyramid geometry would be lost. He used a wooden frame as a guide, 2 boards joined at 45 degrees that he could place against the rising wall to check his angle. Each stone had to be positioned carefully, its weight distributed across the stones below, its top surface tilted slightly inward to receive the next course. Martin Johansen visited on a morning in mid-March. Johansen was a fellow Norwegian immigrant who had arrived in the territory the previous year. His English was poor, and he spoke Norwegian with an accent from coastal regions Lars barely recognized. But the shared language created connection in a place where most men spoke only English. Johansen stood watching Lars work for several minutes before speaking. "You are building a varda," Johansen said finally, using the Norwegian word for cairn. "I am building a cabin," Lars replied, placing a stone and checking its alignment. "A cabin shaped like a varda." "Yes." Johansen walked around the foundation, examining the angle of the walls. "I have seen shepherd huts like this in the mountains near Lillehammer." Lars stopped working and looked up. "You know these structures?" "My grandfather kept sheep in high pastures. He showed me the old huts. Some were 200 years old, still standing, still keeping shepherds warm." Johansen touched the wall stones. "Yours is bigger. I need room to live through winter, not just shelter for a night. The others will think you are crazy. The others already think I am crazy." Johansen nodded. "Caldwell stopped at my place yesterday. He said you were building a Norwegian monument and you would freeze next winter when you realized rocks do not burn." He paused. "He does not understand thermal mass." Lars felt something unexpected. Relief. Someone else understood. "You know why this will work? Stone absorbs heat during day, releases it at night. Thick walls moderate temperature. The shape creates circulation." Johansen gestured at the converging angles. Less volume to heat than a box cabin, and the steep walls shed snow instead of holding weight. They talked for an hour, comparing memories of stone structures from different regions of Norway. April brought rain that turned the building site into mud, but Lars continued working whenever weather allowed. The walls rose course by course, each layer requiring careful stone selection and placement. He developed techniques through repetition. Larger stones on the exterior faces where strength mattered, smaller stones and rubble filling the interior gap between exterior and interior faces, creating walls that were 2 feet thick at the base. Every fifth course, he placed tie stones that extended through the full wall thickness, binding the interior and exterior together. The work was methodical and consuming. Lars rose with dawn light and worked until darkness made stone placement dangerous. His hands became calloused from handling rough stone edges. His back developed a permanent ache from lifting and positioning weights that ranged from 20 to 200 pounds. He lost weight he could not afford to lose, his body consuming itself to fuel labor that seemed never-ending. Other settlers passed occasionally, traveling the trace that ran past Lars's property toward the trading post 30 miles west. Most stopped to watch briefly, shaking their heads at the strange pyramid rising from the Montana earth. A few asked questions Lars answered with minimal detail. Some offered advice he did not want. Build with logs. Build faster. Build something normal. Lars thanked them and continued stacking stones. By late April, the walls had reached chest height, and the pyramid's shape was unmistakable. The structure no longer looked like the foundation of something normal. It looked exactly like what it was. A pyramid made of stone, rising from frontier land where such things did not belong. The visual strangeness increased Lars's isolation. Neighbors who might have stopped to talk kept writing. The pyramid marked Lars as someone outside the normal boundaries of frontier community. He did not care. The walls were rising true, the angles holding steady, the thick stone mass accumulating thermal capacity that would matter desperately when winter returned. Lars worked alone, speaking to no one for days at a time, existing in a state of focused obsession that left room for nothing beyond the next stone, the next course, the next increment of progress toward a structure that would not fail the way his log cabin had failed. The corners required special attention. At each corner, Lars laid stones in an alternating pattern. Each course shifted 90 degrees from the one below. This created interlocking strength that prevented the corners from separating under the immense weight accumulating above. He had seen similar corner construction in stone fences in Norway. The principle was simple. No straight vertical joints that could split under stress. By mid-May, the walls had reached 8 feet, halfway to the apex. The pyramid's interior was becoming defined space rather than abstract plan. Lars could stand inside and look up at converging walls that would eventually meet 16 feet above the foundation. The window openings presented challenges Lars had not fully anticipated. He needed windows for light and ventilation, but cutting openings in sloped stone walls required techniques he had to invent as he worked. Standard frontier windows were simple rectangular frames set into vertical log walls. Lars's pyramid had no vertical surfaces. Every wall sloped inward at 45 degrees, creating complex geometry at every opening. He started with the south-facing wall, where winter sun would provide maximum benefit. At a height of 6 feet above the interior floor, he began leaving a rectangular gap in the stone courses. The gap measured 12 inches wide and 18 inches tall, small by conventional standards, but adequate for his purposes. The challenge was creating a frame that would support the stone courses above while fitting securely into sloped walls. Lars carved thick pine timbers into wedge shapes that matched the wall angle. These formed the top and bottom of the window frame. The sides were simpler, vertical pieces that connected top and bottom. He fitted the entire assembly into the gap he had left in the stonework, then continued building courses above, letting the weight of upper stones lock the frame into position. The technique worked, but it consumed 3 days per window. He planned 4 windows total, 1 on each wall, positioned for cross ventilation and light distribution. The south window would catch winter sun. The north window would provide ventilation during summer heat. East and west windows would balance light throughout the day. Each opening reduced the pyramid's structural integrity slightly, but Lars compensated by using especially large stones around the window frames and extending tie stones through the wall on courses immediately above and below each opening. William Porter stopped by in early June while Lars was installing the third window frame. Porter was younger than most homesteaders, perhaps 25 years old, with the enthusiasm of someone still convinced frontier life would make him rich. He had built his cabin the previous fall using the standard 4-day method Caldwell had referenced. Now he stood examining Lars's pyramid with genuine curiosity rather than mockery. "How many windows are you putting in?" Porter asked. 4, Lars said, checking the frame's alignment. "That is twice what most cabins have. You will lose heat through all that glass." "I am not using glass?" "Oiled paper, then." "No. Canvas treated with resin, mounted behind wooden shutters." Porter climbed partway up the wall to examine a completed window more closely. "Why so many openings if you are worried about heat loss?" "I am not worried about heat loss," Lars said. "The stone walls will hold enough heat that windows will not matter." "Stone is cold. Stone holds temperature. If the interior is warm, stone stays warm and radiates heat inward. If the interior is cold, stone stays cold. The key is getting the stone warm and keeping it that way." Porter studied the pyramid's geometry, the thick walls, the converging angles. "And you think the shape helps? Less air to heat, better circulation. The heat rises to the peak and spreads back down the sloped walls instead of pooling uselessly at a flat ceiling. Caldwell says you are wasting your time. Caldwell burns 4 cords of wood every winter and his cabin stays cold." Porter nodded slowly. "My cabin used 5 cords last winter. I froze most nights despite keeping the fire going." He looked at Lars directly. "If this works, would you show me how to build one?" "If this works," Lars said, "I will show anyone who wants to know." By July, the walls had reached 12 feet, leaving only 4 feet to the apex. The interior space was now clearly defined, a pyramid-shaped room with a floor footprint of 16 feet square and walls that converged toward a point overhead. Lars had to solve the problem of making this unusual geometry functional for daily living. He began with the floor. The foundation stones provided a level base, but Lars wanted to separate his living space from ground moisture. He built a raised floor using thick pine planks laid across log joists that rested on stone ledges he had built into the walls during construction. The floor sat 6 inches above the foundation, creating an air gap that would provide insulation and drainage for any moisture that seeped through the stones. The chimney was critical. Lars positioned it in the exact center of the pyramid, running vertically from floor to apex. He built it using his best stones, creating a flue that would carry smoke out while radiating heat inward from all sides. The chimney's central location meant heat would radiate equally to all walls, rather than concentrating in one area as it did in cabins with corner fireplaces. At the base, Lars built a circular stone hearth, large enough to contain a fire, but modest enough to avoid wasting wood. Around the chimney, Lars planned his interior space with careful efficiency. The ground floor would hold his sleeping platform, a work table, storage shelves, and the hearth. But the pyramid's geometry created additional possibilities. At 8 feet above the floor, where the converging walls were still 8 feet apart, Lars built a second platform. This loft level would provide additional storage and sleeping space if needed. More importantly, it created 2 distinct thermal zones. The ground floor would be warmest, heated directly by the hearth. The loft would be slightly cooler, but still comfortable, warmed by rising heat. The construction of interior elements required Lars to work from inside the pyramid as walls rose around him. He built scaffolding using poles lashed together, allowing him to reach higher courses as they approached the apex. Working inside the structure gave him constant awareness of how the space felt. The thick walls created a sense of shelter and permanence, completely unlike the thin log walls of his old cabin. Even unfinished, with gaps still open at the top, the pyramid felt protected from outside weather. Martin Johansson returned in late July and helped Lars lift the heaviest beams into position for the loft floor. The 2 men worked in Norwegian, Johansson asking questions about structural details while Lars explained his reasoning. The conversation reminded Lars of building with his father in Norway, that same methodical problem-solving and shared understanding of craft principles. "The walls will meet soon," Johansson observed, looking up at the converging stones. 2 more weeks if the weather holds. Then what? The roof. Then the door. Then I move in before first snow. You think it will be ready? Lars looked around the interior, calculating remaining tasks. It has to be ready. August brought visitors Lars did not welcome. Thomas Caldwell arrived with 3 other settlers, James McReady, an older man who had homesteaded in the valley for 5 years, Daniel Cross, a trapper who kept a cabin 8 miles west, and Isaac Brennan, a younger homesteader recently arrived from Pennsylvania. They rode up to the pyramid site together, clearly having planned this visit as a group. Lars was working on the apex, fitting the final courses of stone that would complete the walls. He saw them coming and climbed down from his scaffolding, knowing confrontation was inevitable. "We came to see your monument, fool," Caldwell said, the word carrying obvious mockery. "Thought we should observe this marvel before winter comes and proves what a waste it is." The other men spread out around the pyramid, examining it from different angles. McReady walked completely around the structure, shaking his head. Cross peered through a window opening. Brennan just stared, his expression mixing disbelief with something approaching pity. "You spent the entire summer building a pile of rocks," McReady said. "You could have built 3 cabins in that time. Good log cabins that would actually keep you warm." "This will keep me warm," Lars said. "Rock does not insulate," Cross said from the window. "Any fool knows that. You might as well build your cabin from ice." "The rock holds heat," Lars tried to explain. "Once warm, it stays warm and radiates." "It radiates cold," Caldwell interrupted. "That is what stone does. Why do you think no one builds stone cabins? Because they do not work." Lars felt anger rising but kept his voice level. "In Norway—" "This is not Norway," McReady cut him off. "This is Montana territory. We have ways of doing things that work. You want to survive? Build like we build." Brennan spoke for the first time, and his voice quieter than the others. "What happens when you realize this does not work? You have no time to build a real cabin before snow. You will freeze. "I will not freeze." Caldwell dismounted and walked to the entrance Lars had framed in the south wall. "This door opening is tiny. A man has to bend to get inside." "Why would you do that?" "Small openings lose less heat. Or maybe you built it small because you ran out of ambition halfway through and decided to finish with a design for midgets." The other men laughed. Lars said nothing, recognizing that argument was pointless. These men had made up their minds. The pyramid violated their understanding of proper construction. Its strangeness offended their sense of frontier practicality. Nothing Lars could say would change their opinions. Only winter would prove who was correct. "We are just trying to help you," McCready said, his tone softening slightly. "You are new to this country. You lost your brother. We understand grief makes men do foolish things. But you need to accept reality. This stone tent will not protect you when temperatures drop to 30 below. You will freeze to death inside your own monument to pride." The final stone went into place on the 3rd of September. Lars stood on scaffolding inside the pyramid, fitting a capstone into the apex where all 4 walls met. The stone was triangular, specially shaped to fill the small gap remaining at the top. He lowered it carefully, feeling it settle into position with the solid finality of completion. The walls were finished. The pyramid was sealed. Lars climbed down and stood at the center of the interior, looking up at stone surfaces that converged 16 feet above him. Light entered through the 4 window openings, creating crossing beams in the dusty air. The space felt different from any structure he had inhabited. The sloped walls created acoustic properties that made even small sounds distinct. His footsteps on the wooden floor echoed softly. The air smelled of stone and pine and the dried resin he had used to seal gaps between courses. He spent the next week completing interior details. He built shutters for each window, thick planks hinged on the inside that could be secured with wooden bars. Behind each shutter he mounted canvas he had treated with pine resin, creating a translucent barrier that would allow diffused light while blocking wind. He installed shelves along the lower walls where they were still nearly vertical. He constructed a sleeping platform raised 2 feet off the floor with storage space beneath. He built a simple table and chair. Each piece was overbuilt, solid, designed to last. On September 10th, with the first hints of autumn cold arriving in evening air, Lars lit the first fire in his pyramid cabin. He used dry pine kindling and small logs, building a modest fire in the central hearth he had constructed around the chimney base. The flames caught quickly. Smoke rose through the chimney and out the apex opening. Lars had built a stone cap that allowed smoke to escape while preventing rain from entering directly. He sat on his sleeping platform and watched the fire, paying attention to how heat moved through the space. Warm air rose toward the apex as expected, but the converging walls forced circulation. Heat radiated from the central chimney stones in all directions. Within an hour, Lars could feel warmth spreading through the entire interior. The stone walls, cold from months of construction exposure, began absorbing heat slowly. By evening, the interior temperature had risen noticeably, despite outside temperatures dropping toward freezing. Lars added 2 more logs to the fire, smaller pieces than he would have used in his old cabin. The pyramid stayed warm. He ate dinner, washed his plate, and sat watching darkness gather outside his windows while firelight played across sloped stone walls. That night, Lars slept comfortably for the first time since Henrik's death. The fire burned down to coals. Outside temperature dropped below freezing, but inside the pyramid, thick walls that had absorbed heat throughout the evening continued radiating warmth slowly inward. The temperature remained stable. When Lars woke in the early morning darkness, he could see his breath, but the cold was not the penetrating, brutal cold of his log cabin. This was manageable cold in a space that would warm quickly when he rebuilt the fire. He lay in darkness, listening to silence, and allowed himself to believe the pyramid might actually work. Lars began tracking wood consumption with the methodical attention of a man conducting an experiment. He stacked his remaining firewood in neat cords beside the pyramid, each cord carefully measured and separated. Every morning he noted how many logs he had burned through the previous day and night. Every evening he recorded the interior temperature using a thermometer he had purchased at the trading post years earlier. The numbers told a story that grew more convincing with each passing week. In his old log cabin, maintaining livable temperatures through a cold night required approximately 8 logs, each piece 18 inches long and 4 to 6 inches in diameter. Lars and Henrik had burned through roughly 1 cord every 3 weeks during the depths of winter. The pyramid used half that amount. 4 logs per day maintained comfortable warmth even when outside temperatures dropped to 20 below zero. The difference came from multiple factors working together. The pyramid's reduced interior volume meant less air to heat. The thick stone walls absorbed heat during the day and released it gradually through the night, moderating temperature swings. The central chimney radiated heat in all directions rather than losing it through an exterior wall. The small, well-sealed door and resin-treated canvas windows prevented air infiltration that had plagued the log cabin, and the converging walls created natural circulation that distributed heat evenly instead of letting it stratify uselessly at a flat ceiling. October brought the first serious cold. Frost appeared on grass in the mornings. Ice formed on standing water. Neighbors began burning fires constantly, smoke rising from chimneys across the valley as settlers prepared for winter's arrival. Lars burned his modest fires and tracked his consumption. By month's end, his numbers were undeniable. The pyramid was using 50% less wood while maintaining warmer interior temperatures than his log cabin had ever achieved. He mentioned this to Martin Johansson during a chance meeting on the trail to the trading post. Johansson listened carefully, asked specific questions about measurement methods, then nodded. "The stone is holding heat like you planned, but will it hold through January when cold becomes serious?" "I think it will," Lars said. "The stone takes time to warm fully. It has been absorbing heat for 6 weeks now. The walls are still getting warmer. By January, the entire mass should be thoroughly heated. That thermal capacity should carry through even the coldest nights. Caldwell will not believe it until he sees proof. Caldwell does not need to believe anything. I am not trying to convince him." But word was spreading regardless of Lars's intentions. Settlers talked. Trappers passing through the valley stopped to see the strange pyramid cabin and reported their observations at the trading post. Some repeated the mockery, calling it Eriksson's Folly or the Norwegian Monument. Others noted with surprise that smoke rose only intermittently from the pyramid's chimney while neighboring cabins burned fires constantly. A few began asking quiet questions about construction methods and thermal principles they did not fully understand but could not entirely dismiss. William Porter stopped by in early November. He had brought his own thermometer and asked permission to compare readings. Lars agreed. They hung Porter's thermometer inside the pyramid and checked both instruments throughout the afternoon. The readings matched. The interior maintained steady temperature around 60 degrees, while outside air measured 32 degrees. Porter's own cabin, he admitted, never exceeded 50 degrees inside, even with fires burning continuously. "How?" Porter asked simply. Lars explained again about thermal mass and geometry and circulation. This time, Porter listened with the attention of someone genuinely trying to understand rather than searching for reasons to dismiss. December arrived with temperatures that shocked even experienced frontiersmen. A high-pressure system settled over the Montana Territory, bringing clear skies and cold that intensified it daily. By the second week of December, morning temperatures were reaching 30 below zero. By the third week, they dropped to 40 below. Trappers abandoned their lines. Livestock died in poorly insulated barns. Families huddled inside cabins, burning wood at rates that made even large stockpiles seem inadequate. Lars burned 4 logs per day and remained comfortable. The pyramid's thick walls, thoroughly warmed through 3 months of gradual heat absorption, released stored thermal energy slowly through the long, cold nights. Interior temperatures dropped overnight, but never below 40 degrees, even when outside air reached 40 below. Each morning, Lars rebuilt his fire, and within an hour, the interior warmed back to comfortable levels. His wood consumption remained steady, while neighbors increased their burning, trying desperately to maintain minimal warmth. Thomas Caldwell's situation deteriorated visibly. Lars saw him hauling firewood on sleds almost daily, dragging logs from increasingly distant timber as nearby deadfall was exhausted. Caldwell's face showed the gaunt exhaustion of a man not sleeping, burning wood through the night to keep his family from freezing. Other settlers faced similar struggles. James McCready's woodpile, visible from the trail, shrank at alarming rates. Daniel Cross abandoned his remote cabin entirely and moved to the trading post where multiple families shared resources and warmth. On December 20th, a Sunday, William Porter knocked on Lars's door in late afternoon. Lars opened the small door and stepped aside to let Porter enter. Porter had to bend to fit through the opening, then stood inside staring around the interior with obvious amazement. "It is warm in here," Porter said, his voice carrying disbelief. "Actually warm, not just less cold. Warm." "Yes, Lars said simply. "How warm?" Lars checked his thermometer. 58 degrees. "It is 35 below outside. I checked before I left my cabin." "I know." Porter walked around the interior, touching the stone walls, feeling radiant heat coming from surfaces that should have been cold. He examined the modest fire burning in the central hearth, noting how small it was compared to the roaring fires frontier cabins required. He looked up at the converging walls, finally understanding what Lars had tried to explain months earlier. "The stone is warm," Porter said, pressing both hands against the wall. "The stone itself is radiating heat. It absorbed heat gradually over 3 months. Now it releases that heat slowly, moderating temperature regardless of what happens outside. And the shape makes the warm air circulate instead of rising uselessly to a peak." "Yes?" Porter sat on Lars's chair without asking, still processing what he was experiencing. "Caldwell is burning 6 logs a day now, maybe more. His family is still cold. He told me last week he might not have enough wood to make it to March. He should have built differently. We all should have built differently." Porter looked at Lars directly. "Will you teach me how to build one of these before next winter?" "Yes. Others will want to know. Once they understand this works, they will want to know." Lars added a log to his fire, a single piece of wood that would burn slowly for hours. "Then I will teach them too." January arrived with no relief from the cold. If anything, temperatures dropped further. The high-pressure system that had settled over the territory in December showed no signs of moving. Clear skies and brutal cold continued day after day. Settlers who had thought themselves prepared discovered that preparation based on normal winters was inadequate for what 1854 was delivering. Thomas Caldwell's woodpile, which had held 8 cords in October, was nearly gone by mid-January. Lars saw this on the rare occasions he traveled past Caldwell's property. The once substantial stack had diminished to perhaps half a cord, maybe less. At the rate Caldwell was burning, that represented less than 2 weeks of fuel, and February stretched ahead, often the coldest month in the high country. On January 16th, Lars was splitting firewood outside his pyramid when he saw smoke rising from Caldwell's chimney in an unusual pattern. Instead of the steady column that indicated a well-fed fire, the smoke came in intermittent puffs, suggesting Caldwell was rationing fuel, letting fires burn low to conserve wood. Lars knew what that meant. The Caldwell family was choosing between warmth now and survival later, burning less to make wood last longer, gambling they could endure cold until temperatures moderated. 3 days later, Sarah Caldwell appeared at Lars's door. She was wrapped in blankets, her face red from cold and wind, leading her 2 children by their hands. The children, a boy of 8 and a girl of 6, were shivering despite their layers of clothing. Sarah's eyes showed exhaustion and something close to panic. "We have no more wood," she said without preamble. "Thomas went to cut more 2 days ago. He has not come back. I think he is hurt, or he got lost. The children are freezing. Please." Lars opened the door wider. "Come inside." The three entered the pyramid, and Lars watched. Their reactions. The children stopped shivering within minutes, their faces showing confusion at the warmth. Sarah stood near the central hearth, tears running down her face. Whether from relief or despair, Lars could not determine. "How is it so warm?" she asked. "The stone holds heat," Lars said. He was already pulling on his heavy coat and gathering rope and supplies. "Where did Thomas go to cut wood?" "The timber, 2 miles north. He said the closer deadfall was gone." Lars knew the area. Dense pine forest in a drainage where standing dead trees were common, also where a man working alone in extreme cold could easily become disoriented or injured. "I will look for him. You and the children stay here. Keep the fire going. There is food in that box. Do not leave until I return or someone comes for you." Sarah nodded, holding her children close, still staring around the pyramid's interior as if seeing something impossible. Lars took his rifle not for hunting but for signaling and headed north into cold that made breathing painful. He found Thomas Caldwell 4 hours later, 2 miles from his cabin, sitting against a tree with his axe beside him. Caldwell's right leg was broken, probably from a fall on ice. He had tried to splint it with branches but had been unable to walk. He had built a small fire that had since gone out. When Lars found him, Caldwell was barely conscious, hypothermic and frostbitten. Lars got Caldwell onto a makeshift sled and dragged him back to the pyramid. It took 3 hours of brutal labor through darkness and cold. Thomas Caldwell spent 3 days recovering in Lars's pyramid cabin, while his wife and children occupied the loft space. The warmth that Lars had engineered saved Caldwell's life. The frostbite that would have resulted in amputation in a cold cabin healed with minimal damage in the pyramid's stable temperatures. The broken leg, splinted properly and kept warm, began mending without the complications that cold and moisture would have caused. During those 3 days, Sarah Caldwell witnessed what her husband had refused to see. She watched Lars maintain comfortable warmth, burning 4 logs per day, while their own cabin had required 8 or more. She felt heat radiating from stone walls that her husband had insisted would be colder than wood. She saw her children playing comfortably in shirt sleeves while outside temperatures remained deadly. And she understood with absolute clarity that pride and tradition had nearly killed her family. On the 3rd day, when Thomas was coherent and stable, Sarah confronted him directly while Lars was outside. Lars heard raised voices through the thick walls, though he could not distinguish words. When he entered later, Thomas was sitting up on the sleeping platform, his expression showing something Lars had not seen before: humility. "I was wrong," Thomas said when Lars entered. "I told everyone you were building a monument to foolishness. I said you would freeze. I mocked you for wasting time on rocks when logs were faster and better." He gestured at the warm interior. "I was completely wrong." Lars added wood to the fire, saying nothing. "My family would have died," Thomas continued. "We would have run out of wood in another week. Even if I had not broken my leg, we could not have cut and hauled enough to survive February. We would have burned furniture, then floorboards, then we would have frozen anyway." He looked at Lars directly. "Your cabin saved our lives. Your impossible rock pyramid that I told everyone was insane saved my wife and children." "The pyramid is not impossible," Lars said. "It is just different." Sarah spoke from the loft ladder where she had been listening. "Thomas has something to ask you." Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "Will you teach me how to build one? When my leg heals and spring comes, will you show me how to do this?" "Yes." "And the others? William Porter asked you already, I know, but there will be more. James McReady is burning his furniture now. Daniel Cross abandoned his cabin. Isaac Brennan told me last week he might not make it to March. They will all want to know how you did this once they understand it works." Lars thought about his brother Henrik, about watching him die in a cabin built exactly as tradition dictated. He thought about knowledge that saved lives, about innovations that spread because they solved real problems people faced. "I will teach anyone who wants to learn." Over the next week, word spread through the scattered homestead community. The Norwegian stone pyramid was not a monument to madness. It was a solution to a problem everyone faced. While neighbors froze despite burning massive amounts of wood, Lars Eriksson stayed comfortable using half the fuel. The pyramid that had been mocked now represented survival. William Porter arrived on a February morning, carrying a journal and pencil. He had walked 4 miles through snow to reach Lars's pyramid, and he came prepared to document everything. Lars invited him inside, and Porter spent the day taking notes while Lars explained construction principles. "The foundation must be level," Lars said, showing Porter his technique. "Uneven foundation means walls will settle differently, creating cracks that leak air and reduce thermal mass efficiency." Porter wrote quickly, sketching diagrams beside his notes. "Why 45-degree angle specifically? Could the walls be steeper or more shallow?" They could, but 45 degrees provides the best balance. Steeper walls create less interior volume but become unstable above certain heights. Shallower walls enclose more air to heat and lose the circulation benefit. 45 degrees is optimal for a structure this size. They discussed stone selection, wall thickness, window placement, door design, chimney location, and the importance of thermal mass. Porter asked questions that showed he was thinking beyond simple imitation, trying to understand underlying principles, so he could adapt them to his own situation. Lars appreciated this approach. He was not teaching a recipe to follow blindly, but sharing knowledge that could be applied creatively. Isaac Brennan came the next week, younger and less experienced, but equally serious about learning. Lars walked him through the entire process again, answering different questions, explaining the same principles from new angles. Brennan was particularly interested in the construction timeline and labor requirements. "You worked alone for 6 months, Brennan said. Could 2 men build one in 3 months? Probably. The stone hauling is the most time-consuming part. 2 men could gather stones twice as fast. The actual construction might go faster with help or slower if both men are learning. 3 months seems reasonable if you start in April." By late February, Lars had explained his pyramid design to 7 different settlers. Some came alone, others in pairs. All brought the same desperate energy of men who had nearly died during the winter and were determined not to repeat the experience. Lars shared everything freely. He showed them his sketches, explained his calculations, demonstrated stone stacking techniques, and answered every question with patience. Martin Johansson came in early March, not to learn but to share information. "There are families building pyramids in the valleys east of here," he said. "I heard about it at the trading post. Settlers who talk to people who talk to you. The design is spreading." "Good," Lars said simply. "They are calling them Norwegian cabins or Eriksson pyramids. Some people say you invented something new." "I invented nothing. I remembered stone huts from Norway and adapted them for this place. The knowledge is old. I just applied it where it was needed." "Still, your name is attached now. The technique is spreading because you proved it works and taught others freely." Lars thought about this. He had not sought recognition or tried to profit from his design. He had simply built something that solved his own survival problem, then shared it with neighbors when they asked. Spring of 1854 brought construction activity unprecedented in the Montana high country. As snow melted and ground thawed, settlers began building pyramid cabins across the valley and in adjacent territories. Some followed Lars's design precisely, creating 16-foot square pyramids with 45-degree walls. Others adapted the principles to their specific needs and available materials. A trapper named Daniel Cross built a smaller 12-foot pyramid as a winter shelter. James McCready constructed a larger 20-foot version to house his extended family. Each variation maintained the core principles: steep sloped walls, thick stone construction, central chimney, minimal openings. William Porter finished his pyramid by late June, working with his brother who had arrived from the east that spring. Porter had documented every step, creating a construction guide more detailed than Lars's original sketches. He shared this guide with other settlers, accelerating the spread of knowledge. By July, at least 15 pyramid cabins were under construction within a 30-mile radius of Lars's original structure. The variations revealed creative adaptation. Some builders used different stone types based on local availability: limestone, sandstone, granite, whatever could be gathered and stacked. A few settlers who lacked sufficient stone created hybrid designs, using stone for lower walls and logs for upper sections, maintaining the pyramid shape while reducing stone hauling labor. These hybrids worked less efficiently than pure stone construction, but they still outperformed traditional rectangular log cabins significantly. Isaac Brennan made an important discovery while building his pyramid. He found that mixing clay into the gaps between stones, creating mortar rather than dry stacking, increased structural stability and further improved thermal mass. He shared this technique with others, and it became standard practice for later pyramid construction. Lars incorporated the mortaring method into his own cabin during maintenance that summer, filling gaps he had initially left open. The economic implications became apparent as settlers calculated fuel savings. A family that had burned 8 cords of wood per winter in a log cabin needed only 4 cords in a pyramid. This represented enormous labor savings, freeing time for other productive activities. It also reduced the environmental impact on nearby forests, allowing timber resources to regenerate rather than being consumed entirely for fuel. Not everyone adopted the pyramid design. Some settlers remained committed to traditional methods, unwilling to invest the time required for stone construction or unconvinced that the benefits justified the effort. Thomas Caldwell, despite his near-death experience, built a conventional log cabin when he relocated to a different property the following year. But even skeptics acknowledged that pyramid cabins worked. The evidence was undeniable. Families in pyramids stayed warmer using less wood. By autumn of 1854, pyramid cabins had become an established alternative to traditional frontier construction. Travelers passing through the territory reported seeing the distinctive structures and hearing stories about the Norwegian settler who had survived a brutal winter in a cabin built from stone and geometry. The technique continued spreading, carried by word of mouth and direct observation, into Wyoming and Idaho territories where winters presented similar challenges. Lars Erickson left the Montana Territory in 1857. The fur trade that had drawn many settlers westward had collapsed entirely. Homesteading offered limited prospects in a region with short growing seasons and isolated markets. Lars sold his property to Martin Johansson, who maintained the original pyramid cabin, and built a second structure nearby using improved techniques developed over 3 years of collective experience. Lars moved to the Oregon Territory, where he purchased land in a river valley with milder climate and better agricultural potential. He married in 1858 a widow named Anna, who had traveled west with a wagon train. They built a conventional farmhouse, not a pyramid, because the Oregon climate did not require extreme thermal engineering. They raised 3 children who never experienced the brutal Montana winters their father had survived. Lars lived quietly, farming and occasionally doing carpentry work for neighbors. He never promoted his pyramid design or sought recognition for what he had created. But in the mountains he had left, the pyramids remained. Stone structures built to survive harsh winters did exactly that, standing solid through decades, while conventional log cabins rotted and collapsed. Settlers continued building variations of Lars's design into the 1860s and 1870s. The technique became known simply as the Norwegian method, attributed to Scandinavian immigrants generally rather than to Lars specifically. This suited Lars fine. He had not built his pyramid for fame. He had built it to survive. The phrase, "built like a Norwegian pyramid," became frontier shorthand for exceptional durability and thermal efficiency. When settlers needed structures that would withstand extreme conditions, they referenced the design principles Lars had demonstrated. Some pyramids built in 1854 were still inhabited in the 1880s, occupied by new generations who had never met Lars but benefited from his innovation. Modern historians estimate the pyramid cabin design saved at least 24 lives during winters between 1854 and 1870. The exact number is unknowable because survival often goes unrecorded, but period journals and letters reference families weathering severe cold in pyramid shelters while neighbors in conventional cabins faced life-threatening conditions. The fuel efficiency alone prevented countless cases of frostbite, hypothermia, and cold-related illness that plagued frontier communities. Lars Eriksson died in 1876 at age 49 from injuries sustained when a horse kicked him during routine farm work. He was buried in a small cemetery near Salem, Oregon. His gravestone recorded only his name, birth year, and death year. No mention of Montana, no reference to pyramids, nothing to indicate he had changed frontier architecture. But 800 miles away, in valleys where winter still tested human endurance, stone pyramids stood weathering snow and wind. Anonymous monuments to the principle that survival depends not on following tradition, but on understanding why things work and having the courage to build something different when tradition fails. Lars Eriksson's impossible pyramid had become routine, proving that innovation born from necessity and shared freely creates legacies more durable than stone.